So we're almost there. We're going back to the beginning. Huh? As I said at the beginning, the last lecture could also have been the beginning, which is the great thing about what I think Professor Stanislaus von Moos is going to do on Le Corbusier before Le Corbusier. Stanislaus von Moos is currently professor of art history at Zurich University. He's taught at Harvard, at Delft, and a number of other institutions, and has been an incredibly prolific writer on architecture, with books on Renaissance architecture and industrial design, 2 books on Venturi, and numerous articles on Corb, in particular the book that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, Elements of a Synthesis, published in English in 1978 and originally in German in 1968, and a more recent, beautiful album that has been published in English by Monicelli on Le Corbusier. Please welcome Professor Stanislaus von Moos.
Maybe first I should say that I'm amazed to be here in a place that arguably played some role in the branding, in my branding as a so-called Corb scholar. Because if I wouldn't have been invited by Charles Jenks, I think it was Charles Jenks, I won't tell you how many years ago, maybe I would have remained what I basically am, a local art historian who has once had an interest in Le Corbusier. Anyway, I've written up what I have to say because I was obviously also under the strain of being limited to that stretch of time that we've been assigned, so I ask you simply to interrupt when you think now it really is enough. So I just simply start reading. Le Corbusier's conception of the synthesis of the arts. Well, the embarrassment is, of course, that I've written this up before. I was listening to all of the things that we've heard together, and I wish I'd had been able to incorporate the insights that I have been able to gain into this paper, but this will happen at a later stage, obviously. Le Corbusier's conception of the synthesis of the arts, synthèse des arts majeurs, is generally explained in terms of morphological analogies. And I think in the demonstration by Daniel Nagel, we have just had a very fine demonstration of this approach. Not only this approach, but I think morphological analogies clearly played a major role in his demonstrations. A purist still life and a floor plan of the Villa Savoie placed side by side, or the meandering outlines of those voluminous female nudes of the 1930s, with their mouths wide open, frozen in the act of speech or frozen in the act tout court, and with colossal clamp-like hands set next to the plan obus, such is the evidence usually called upon. In the light of the constellations that I would like to evoke in my paper, there may be other clues to the question. One such clue is offered by the curious menu that serves as an illustration to an article in L'Esprit Nouveau, number 22, published in 1924. What we have is an inventory of emblematic cityscapes, or so it appears, especially in the light of the rather grandiloquent title of the article for which it serves as an illustration, Classement et Choix, Ordering and Choice. The illustration includes a drawing of Pera, a suburb of Istanbul, on top of the image, and immediately below of Istanbul as seen from the Bosporus. Then follows a catalogue of geometric forms, cube, cylinder, pyramid, symbolizing the architecture of Rome, and finally, at the bottom, a drawing made after a 17th century print that shows the skyline of Siena, and it is no coincidence in the context of Le Corbusier's interests at that time that this skyline also reminds one of New York. In order to make the graphic menu look like a systematic demonstration, notes are added in the margin. You see it on the right? Notes are added in the margins that postulate a correspondence between the images and the character of the places they represent. I read those in my clumsy English translation. On top, Pera, the saw blade of the city of merchants, pirates, gold seekers, and then Istanbul, the ardor of the minarets, the calmness of the flattened domes, Allah, vigilant but orientally imperishable. Third, Rome, geometry, the implacable order, war, civilization, organization. And fourth, bottom, Siena, the anguished tumult of the Middle Ages, hell and paradise. This hell and paradise goes, of course, also by implication, I would say, for New York. In such a way, urban form is explained in terms of culture, and culture in terms of urban form. And what we are made to understand is that the diversity of the menu, in short, is not a question of mere urban typologies. Rather than with architectural typologies, we are dealing with a typology of visual means capable of representing cityscapes in graphic terms. First, at the top of the page, the rapid impression, impression, of the urban skyline integrated in the landscape. Then, in the middle, the typological inventory of the monumental architecture of Rome. And finally, at the bottom, the quotation of a historic veduta. Why associate impression with Pera or Istanbul, the typological inventory with Rome, and the antiquarian veduta with Siena? Why should not Istanbul instead of Rome be subjected to a typological scanning? And why should not Rome be represented as a classical landscape in a tradition of Corot or Ingres? The figure offers absolutely no clue to such questions. Clearly, these associations are first of all a question of personal preference. They reflect biographical coincidence. The focus of interest lies not so much in the fact as such, it has shifted towards the mechanism of its perception. Or, to allude to what we've heard earlier today in the talk by Fernando, the focus has shifted from product to mythology. All that draws our attention to the very early years of Le Corbusier's career. It is difficult not to be disturbed, also not to be charmed, by the eclecticism of the studies Jeanneret made during the years of his itinerant education in Italy, in Germany, in Turkey, and in Greece, and then again in southern Italy. According to time, place, and circumstance, he either adopts the gaze of the specialist, like, for instance, here the specialist in urban typology when he talks about Rome or makes a drawing of Rome, or then the gaze of the tourist, as he would do sometime later in the menu that I have just discussed. During the first trip to Italy, after the completion of the Villa Fallet, in the fall of 1907, we see, of course, Jeanneret in the middle of that picture on the left. During the first trip to Italy, after the completion of Villa Fallet, the entire spectrum of the lessons taken in La Chaux-de-Fonds is displayed, first of all in the many letters sent to his parents, his friends, and the master Charles Le Platinier. In these comments, paintings seen in museums and churches are subjected to various kinds of exams. Some are judged according to criteria of decorative surface organization, with Owen Jones, the plate from Owen Jones on the right screen, with Owen Jones in mind, as well as, of course, the experience of the Villa Fallet, especially the graffiti on the main facade in mind. When we deal with canonized treasures of art, then the work emerges in the light of the aura that has been handed down by the official narratives of art history, and then again the focus is shifted to coloring. And as far as architecture is concerned, quality is either a question of principle, that is a matter of prejudice in favor of an international Gothic at the expense of Giotto and Brunelleschi. Strangely enough, he hates both Giotto and Brunelleschi. And here it is clearly the Ruskinian who speaks. After all, the Villa Fallet had itself been a very Ruskinian exercise, as has been pointed out by Charles earlier. Or then it is a matter of the chromatic effects produced by the reflection of a sunset on a building. An example is the letter dated September 19th, 1907, that describes a visit to Pisa. Quote, "At 6 o'clock, the cathedral is a chromatic enchantment. It is the quintessence of all variations of yellow, of ivory white and black patina on an extraordinary ultramarine. As one continues to look at it, it becomes completely black. The part on which the baptistry casts its shadow vibrates softly in rich yellow nuances. There's inlaid red marble about to awake and black marble turning blue. It is the revenge of the flat surface. They vibrate and speak softly. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the cathedral is even more beautiful than ever before. What tones!" And he continues, "It is I don't know what kind of brown, nor what kind of blue, but what tranquility. Behind me, the sky is orange and mellow, the green of the doors has died, and yellow marble emerges. It is natural sienna, whereas the columns are of a white pink, like the petals of a wild rose. The surface below the small arches of the walls look as if covered by frescoes from next door." He's, of course, alluding to the frescoes in the Camposanto of Pisa. And he continues, "The beautiful frescoes in gold and red, the diffuse shadow extended by the small columns is emerald, and the marble is a grayish black that resembles the neck of certain birds. The three mosaics unfold in this andante, and in their gold the most beautiful sunset is mirrored, while the Virgin's green dress vibrates softly. The carmine has disappeared." Or the carmine has disappeared. Then comes this reference to the complementary color contrast, which is, of course, a fundamental theme in avant-garde art. "Some bambinos are playing in the foreground, one of them with a scarlet dress in front of one of the green bronze doors," he says. A few days later, he tried himself to celebrate these effects in pictorial form, namely in this extraordinary watercolor he did, obviously, on the Piazza del Campo in front of the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. And it is absolutely amazing that probably a few hours later he should walk up Via dei Pellegrini. This is the view taken from the top of the tower of the Siena Palazzo Pubblico, and showing, with, of course, this, I'm particularly proud of this view because it shows the sun indicates the Via dei Pellegrini that goes up to the Duomo with the facade of the baptistry, which probably a few hours later, he has studied, he has analyzed in this extremely Ruskinian fashion, which so starkly contrasts with what we have just seen a minute ago. Of course, I'm not giving a survey of Jeannoret's Italian travel studies, but I want to suggest, at the risk of being pedantic, that the diversity of representational modes can be divided at least into 8 separate categories, but I imagine that anybody could invent more categories. Let's stick to the 8. First, simple working drawings for works of decorative art, such as furniture, carpets, graffiti, which is obviously the most obvious category for a decorator, and Jeanneret was educated as a decorator at his school. Second, architectural plans, including floor plans, elevations, sections, facades, perspectives, done either as a quick draft or a working drawing or as an explanatory sketch or rendering. Obviously, the obvious techniques that an architect would enact under the circumstances of visiting historic buildings. Third, the more or less accurate, more or less free copy of a work of art from the past. And I think some of the more impressive studies that he did in Tuscany belong to that category. of copying, and remind us of the trivial fact that, of course, copying after important works of art was a fundamental thing to do. For a student in art at the turn of the century, you could argue that this aspect of Le Corbusier's career as an architectural student was very much the component of the 19th century, of the classical Beaux-Arts education that he lived through as a pupil of his art school in La Chaux-de-Fonds. These studies being then, if compared, for instance, to studies of contemporary, of his friends and other pupils from the school, are remarkable, as one could argue, which I'm not going to do, in the way not only they represent what he sees, but in the way they interpret what he sees. This is, of course, done in Ravenna. This is done, and this relates clearly to his own interest as an architect. When you think back to the graffiti of the Villa Falle, this is from the floor. This is a floor detail of the baptistry in Florence. And here again, we have him on the right screen, the Cathedral of Lucca, and then compare that to what is obviously the model for this kind of study, a drawing made by Ruskin, watercolor made by Ruskin more or less exactly half a century previously. And then comes fourth, the annotated survey. The annotated survey, or the annotated study of a work of art or a piece of architecture, which also adds up to an important category of works done, of studies done during these trips. A very famous example, very well known, very frequently published, is on the right screen, which is extremely interesting because he goes right into the detail of the architectural quality of this interior space of Santa Croce in Florence, implicitly also arguing with Ruskin, who was against, who questioned the quality, the architectural character even of that interior, whereas Jeanneret, in his demonstration that I won't go into explaining in detail, seems to be determined to prove the opposite, that Ruskin is right, that in fact it is a very decent, a very beautiful, a very dramatic, very impressive space. The left screen, another example of this category of the annotated study, a study obviously from the Palazzo Vecchio, from his own student's room across the Loggia dei Lanzi, with of course the tower, the top of the tower, which had no space on top of the sheet of paper placed at the bottom of it, with an extremely interesting comment to the right. This is a category, a type of study that would obviously survive in the sketchbooks, that would survive until very late days. These are sketches from, this is a suitcase, and this is a toilet bowl drawn according, I mean roughly, according to this typology of the annotated sketch. And at this point, of course, I'm pending on the subsequent categories, the landscape study. I just want to make, unfortunately I don't have that in English, the landscape study, the figure, the portrait, the nude, the still life, all categories that he was in subsequent years exploring and practicing. We have seen many examples of this in earlier today and last night. One note, however, on the category that I describe as urban landscapes. Here, you have already seen this watercolor. Here it is clearly color that gives power to the image. The green cloud that is set off against the red facade of the town hall, the purple patch of sky that answers the yellow top of the campanile. Of course, these Nabi colors cannot be the result of topographical observation. The play of contrast serves to call forth rather than to reproduce a particular situation. As Jeanneret himself has put it, quote, "The color is not of a descriptive, but of an evocative character, by all means symbolic. It is the end and not the means." A somewhat risky thing to do for a mere architecture student. Such a free ride into the forbidden realm of fine arts, and he was fully conscious about it. In 1908, he sent this watercolor to his master Le Platinier from Paris, a provocation of sorts, since only shortly before the master had advised his student to be content with being an architect. Dessine, ça suffit, he had advised him. In his letter, Jeanret's letter to Le Platinier, he apologizes for the impressionistic, as he calls it, extravagance of the work by attributing it cowardly to the stormy weather. Quote, "Don't be too harsh on me because of this small impression of the Palio," he spells it wrongly, but never mind, "the Palio Square in Siena. You know that Siena is the city of colors, since it so happens that a thunderstorm has arrived, igniting all the tones like a fresh watercolor, only to disappear again, picking off some large black clouds in an evening sky of crude green, and since the earth, finally put to rest, has exhaled its blissfulness in wonderful pink touches, caressing the formidable Palazzo Comunale and its walls covered with Persian shawls, you have to understand that in front of such a symphony of color, one cannot help being filled with enthusiasm and being penetrated by these resounding harmonies," as he says. Not enough. Jeanret thinks he should go even further and let his master benefit from a small lesson in contemporary art. Quote, "But perhaps, in fact, you don't understand at all that a kid like me thought it was all right to objectify his impressions in a daub falsely drawn, false in perspective, and even false in color tones," which of course was his explanation of what Impressionism, Fauvism, Nabi is all about, seeing himself very much in that, involved in that particular world of contemporary art. When Jeanret, together with his friend Perrin, visited Tuscany in 1907, it had been by ways of copying and of producing annotated sketches in the tradition of Ruskin that he did what was required of him in his role as a diligent student at his art school, even if there was also, as we have seen, the temptation to exercise the fine arts. This is the mode left again, of course, Ruskin with a drawing that had a lasting impact on many, many studies by Corp. You remember, I mean, his initial studies for that were then reprinted in Modular. I think it was Charles who alluded to them. And on the right, it's a study of Orsa Michele, actually a Donatello sculpture in a niche of Orsa Michele, only that the sculpture has gone on the decorative detail is all that has remained, because at this point he's really totally uninterested in sculpture. He's only interested in the mode of these drawings, only interested in architectural decoration. But then, in 1910, by the time he plans his Grand Tour, the lure of art had become even stronger. 3 years ago, Jeanret had visited Tuscany as an art school student, but now he arrives in Potsdam at the Orangerie of Schloss Sans Souci. As an architect, he's incidentally working with Peter Behrens at this time in nearby Neubabelsberg, yet an architect who places his hobby in the context of international modern art. More than by the architecture of Sans Souci, he appears to be fascinated by the abstract bodies of trees and buildings reflected in the pool. Anyone around 1910 would have experienced such a situation as being virtually pregnant with Expressionism, and more specifically pregnant with Edvard Munch, although I don't want to claim that he was personally knew personally that painting Girls on a Bridge by Edvard Munch. I think that the general familiarity is blatant. At Istanbul, the free study of the urban landscape finally reigns supreme. Jeanret's views of the Golden Horn and of Pera and Istanbul across the Bosporus give the city in terms of the neo-impressionist sea piece. Quote, "Constantinople, I shall probably not see this city in a more enchanting light than this one magic painting by Signac at the Munich exhibition. So he makes it clear that even before he goes to Istanbul, that he wants to see Istanbul with Signac's eye, Signac, the great protagonist of Neo-Impressionism. These words are from a letter written to William Ritter, sent off in Munich a few days before the departure for Istanbul. And upon arrival in Istanbul, the matter achieved a more precise form. He writes this time to Le Platinier, I had constructed my idea of Constantinople with the help of Signac. One thing remains plausible, that Signac had been here, meaning on the other side of the Bosporus, very early in the morning. So one wonders in the end, here is Signac. No, he's disappeared. What can we do? Here he is. So one wonders in the end what the watercolor on the right is about. Is it about reality or is it about art? Is the subject matter Istanbul or is the subject matter Signac, or more precisely, a painting by Signac that Jeanneret had seen a few weeks earlier in Munich? Incidentally, I think it was precisely this painting, which is still apparently in a private collection in Munich. I haven't been able to locate it directly. And I think the comparison makes clear that the echo on the right screen sounds somewhat weak in comparison to the impression that the painting by Signac seems to have made a few months before the watercolor was done. Back home again, Jeanneret did a series of studies of the Jura landscape, and that was of course a pretty obvious thing to do, but it was also inevitably like stumbling into mined territory. Impossible for a former student to ignore the large, carefully calibrated winter landscapes that Charles Le Platinier, an example of it is on the left screen, has done a few years previously. On the other hand, impossible not to acknowledge on Jeanneret's side the wish to be more modern than the master, modern by taking liberties with regard to painterly execution and by displaying in such a way an absence of formality. Mere speculation. In a letter from Germany written in 1911, Jeanneret does blame Le Platinier for not having understood a single thing about the revolution in contemporary art, since Courbet, Manet, and Rodin. Clearly, the urge to demarcate his position with respect to that of the master has become imperative. He now seems ready even to side with Kuno Amiet, the Swiss expressionist or fauve painter, whose loose and flaky landscapes, only barely older, he has described some of those paintings in his visits to Swiss museums, only barely older, announce what Jeanneret himself was up to. So I think although there are few, and there are some mentions, but relatively few mentions of this painter Kuno Amiet, I think he's one of the ideals that he has as a young artist in his town in around 1911-12. As we see, Jeanneret more and more casts himself into the image of a great artist, and this at a very early date. Nothing so much is reflected in this urge than his wish to dissociate himself from Germany and to become part of the cultural establishment of France, where the free arts have become, as he himself insists, incidentally, at the end of his study, Études sur le mouvement d'art décoratif en Allemagne, in 1912, where the free arts have become the agents of cultural progress, as opposed to Germany, where the decorative arts and architecture have remained or are considered the agents of cultural progress. But he wants to side with art. Yeah. As it seems increasingly improbable after this conference that we had today, in the light of the evidence that was assembled during the conference, that the individual named Le Corbusier ever existed, What needs to be done is probably not what I have been trying to do, namely to add a few additional materials to the case, but to ask some more general questions, such as what is the meaning, the logic, the structure behind this plurality of identities that make for the multi-representational Le Corbusier? Is it all to be attributed to a phenomenal capacity of carnivalesque disguise? And if such should be the case, what is the drive behind all this? Is the logic of transgression simply part of the urge to conquer success, using all tools available in the world of culture, surfing on the waves of art in order to always remain on top of the events? Or should we see in the architect's efforts to prevent any way of seeing him as a mere competent professional, worse as a mere specialist, the reincarnation of an old ideal of humanist fulfillment? A conception that postulates that man is only man if he is capable of acting out the spectrum of capacities for which his body and his mind have made him fit? Or is it enough to reduce the problem to a schematic typology of the genius, as, for instance, outlined by Gardner? Most likely, the appropriateness of one or the other among these hypotheses will shift as the work and life constellation itself unfolds over time. Haunted by the spell of unity and synthesis, and more recently of alchemy, symbolism, and mythology, historians have in general been more interested in searching for motival reflections between the genres practiced by the genius. As a result, they have neglected the disturbing discrepancies that emerge between the various modes, in short, the cracks in the unité. For example, when Le Corbusier made his first trip to New York, October 1935, it could be said that he did it for three separate reasons. First, in order to consolidate his fame as the leading artist, architect of the modern movement. Second, in order to demonstrate his caliber as homme de lettres. And third, in order to prepare the territory so that the United States could become the decisive testing ground for the Ville Radieuse. Thus, we see him operate during his 3 months in the United States, as well as in the months afterwards, in the guise of at least 3 separate roles. Needless to say, perhaps, that they are almost identical to those already taken during his student years. First, as impresario of his work as a painter. Second, as arbiter of taste or cultural analyst. In fact, as author of a very strange book on New York, clearly designed to conquer a place on the shelves side by side with those other French commentators of the New World, such as Paul Morand, François Mauriac, or Georges Duhamel. And third, finally, and in this role he turns out to be particularly unsuccessful, despite the fact that one would expect it to be the most obvious one, as promoter of modern architecture, and in particular its urbanistic envelope, or rather its cultural frame of mind, the Ville Radieuse. In fact, the American version of the Ville Radieuse was presented in such a brute form in this book that it is hard to believe that anyone, Le Corbusier included, could have taken it very seriously as urbanism. Perhaps the Christmas card, whatever its intention, this is a Christmas card dated 1947, so 12 years after the first trip to New York, addressed to Lily, as you can see. Incidentally, it was, of course, Rem Koolhaas who published it for the first time, commented it in Delirious New York. Perhaps the Christmas card, whatever its intention, it dates from the times of the debacle of the United Nations Commission, is more aptly understood if placed in relation to the urban bloodshed that began to actually ruin parts of Boston and Philadelphia at pretty much the same time, even if its visual furor probably indicates less Le Corbusier's frustration with these grand operations than his frustration about not having been given a share in them. No. Among the images produced in connection with the American experience, the cover of Quand les cathédrales étaient blanches is the most suggestive. And I think at this point the concept of the museum, as it had been explained a minute ago, is very, very appropriate. What we are given is a cocktail of iconographic projections through space and time. By implication, these fragments also suggest a mix of identities for the author to choose from or to play out as masks. New York is represented by a map showing proposed elevated driveways, actually a map taken from a publication that Le Corbusier purchased while he was in New York. The elevated driveways being outlined in black, as you see. One of them is, of course, the one, the bridge that you see here from underneath. In the back would be Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, this separation of traffic lines being obviously the major obsession that he had while looking at New York. But on another level, the city plan serves as a mirror, as it were, to the Middle Ages. At least it serves to trigger off an entire wealth of paradoxical perceptions and projections, so one sees what the book is made of: fragments from a diary, newspaper articles, newspaper interviews, general cultural small talk, some very interesting descriptions and comments on current architecture, such as when Le Corbusier refers to some recent works of friends and competitors on the American market, like William Lescars and George Howe in Philadelphia. He talks about the PSFS building. He admires its detailing, rightly so. There is no building by Le Corbusier who has anything comparable to offer besides the Villa Falais, as Charles has pointed out yesterday, which is, in terms of its preservation and technical makeup, among the most successful ones. Obviously, he could find here in the details, I don't quite know whether this space is still extant in this way, because we know that PSFS building has been turned recently into a large hotel. Anyway, he admired, he said, he makes the note, when I saw these details, I wrote down into my diary, gods, meaning in an act of generosity vis-à-vis colleagues that is very seldom in Le Corbusier's side, meaning, of course, Howe and Lescars. In fact, should a book on New York written by a modern architect from Paris not be expected to show a modern American building on its cover, Brooklyn Bridge, or, for instance, Rockefeller Center? Instead, we find a piece of Swiss art history that was surely unknown to the overwhelming majority of the readers of the book. Also, incidentally, it's also unknown to the majority of people who have written about Quand les cathédrales étaient blanches, namely St. George overwhelming the dragon from Basel Cathedral. Here is the original. And it is, of course, also an allegoric self-portrait of sorts. For not by coincidence, only St. George and his spear are shown. We understand that the dragon's role is taken over by Manhattan. Then, a fragment from the Très riche heure du Duc de Berry, with the white skyline of an idealized Ile de la Cité, together with the Sainte-Chapelle dominating the entire page. You see it, you see the Sainte-Chapelle here. As to the lower part of the visual quote, it is cut from another image taken from also the Très riche heure du Duc de Berry, but another page, one that is much less directly linkable to New York, for its subject is agriculture, for all sake. This is the source for the top strip, and this is the source for the lower strip, evoking this passion for the natural, for the biological, perhaps for the suburban, to refer to Tim Benton, that obviously is very much in the back of Corbusier's mind as he writes Quand les cathédrales étaient blanches. So the surreal montage of two different illustrations from the Très riche heure illustrates the concepts of the white cathedrals at the top, while also offering a clue to the author's point of view below. For the image indicates that we are no longer dealing here with Le Corbusier the Fordist. The cover says, as would have been politically correct to say in the mid-30s, that the Taylorist dreams of an entire megalopolis subjected to the logic of the assembly line belongs to the past. In fact, the retreat into the values of rustic life, a trend towards the biological and the antiquarian also, has become a theme in Le Corbusier's painting some years before already. Paradoxically, and this is somehow the crack in the book, This demise of technocracy appears not to have lasted until the final chapters, where a trivialized, brute version of the ville contemporaine is offered as the ultimate solution to the corruption of American urbanism. Another highly suggestive crack is the fact that art and its relevance for architecture is only addressed obliquely in the book, despite the extraordinary role art played in the context of Le Corbusier's trip to New York. He was, after all, the host of the Museum of Modern Art. In trivial terms, his success, the only success was that the Museum of Modern Art purchased a model plus a painting that was integrated not only in the permanent collection, but also in the show Cubism and Abstract Art that was shown in 1936. No mention whatsoever of the need of any synthesis of the arts. Clearly, that claim did not interest Le Corbusier at the time, quite unlike Alfred Barr, the director of the museum, for whom it was probably the only interesting aspect of Le Corbusier's works and ideas to begin with. In the book, the issue is only addressed in an indirect fashion, and in fact in terms of an extravagant detour via psychoanalysis. I'm of course referring to the curious episode at Vassar College, Charles has mentioned it, where Le Corbusier was confronted with what appeared to him as an unnecessary passion among women students, Amazons as he called them, for the art of Caravaggio, a passion which, he argues, corresponds with an equally preoccupying American interest in surrealism. We know what sense he made of that aesthetic preference. He saw those preferences as characteristic manifestations of the American soul, as the cultural equivalent of its timid nature and its profound insecurity. Vous aussi, vous souffrez de refoulement, he asked in a condescending way one of those art history students at Vassar. Considering Le Corbusier's own work at about the same time, one is tempted to look with caution at these extravagant conclusions. Could it not be that the painter Le Corbusier himself harbored a considerable interest in that Italian master at that time, that his real worry was that his secret sympathy, his secret passion for Caravaggio was shared by young ladies that he must have qualified as not entirely entitled to such frivolous preoccupations? I think looking at some of the paintings he did exactly the same year, 1935, at least the hypothesis could be formulated that there is something about a Baroque painting, that maybe even something about Caravaggio, that interested him very much at that time. And in a certain sense, at this point, one could indeed, I think, continue in a sort of a gendered analysis of Le Corbusier's painting, in particular also in view of the mural in the back of his Rue de Sèvres studio, where we have this explosion of female power in the background and this poor middle-aged gentleman in the middle who seems to be somehow afraid of undergoing the same fate as Holofernes on the left screen. If such is the case, then ultimately the entire plot, this is why I find those cracks so interesting, if such is the case, then ultimately the entire plot of the book needs to be reversed. If such is the case, then Le Corbusier's extravagant exercise in collective psychoanalysis will inevitably fall back upon himself, suggesting that what is at stake is not so much the psychic problems of the Amazons at Vassar, nor the insecurity of the Americans at large, but his own angst as an individual in permanent search of identity. Thank you very much.
Could I then just ask all the speakers to come to the front here, and I think we should go straight into the discussion. Thank you. Yeah, all, including the people from the morning, please, yeah? I think we should have everyone. Yeah, yeah.
need a microphone.
Now they're all shy suddenly. Yeah, look at that.
Yeah, little bit.
Well, that was fantastic. I'd like to use the same format as we did before lunch by just asking the speakers if they have brief comments about each other's papers for a few minutes before we open it to the audience. Who would like to start? Maybe one sort of general question that might be useful. I don't know if you think is to pick up a topic from the morning which relates to Hilda Heinen's presentation in terms of locating Le Corbusier in the context of the avant-garde and whether Corb was avant-garde or not avant-garde. I think in the context of the presentations made in the afternoon, which were much more dealing with the symbolic, the interpretive dimension, rather than really try and ask you to discuss in relation to Hilda's paper whether he was or he was not, I think it might be more interesting to hear your perspective in terms of how Le Corbusier's work also provides a kind of reflection on the very concept of the avant-garde, and whether it, in your view, for example, might in fact even radicalize the very concept itself. I don't know, Peter, do you want to? Is that, or Dan, or anybody else?
No. We'll make one quick comment. No,
well, you can speak to that speaker.
that's okay. I'll just, if you can't hear me, it doesn't matter. I'll be short. I personally think Le Corbusier, like everybody else at that period, was suffering from what Joyce called a nightmare of history. Notions like the universal and the times that are appropriate to universal simply are suppressed, history becomes the principal vehicle in which meaning comes to be, and history is understood as change. The avant-garde is simply one manifestation of that. I don't know, Mussolini's fascination with technology isn't that different from the usual way people read Corb's interest in technology. But I also think Le Corbusier is much more sensitive. I mean, he kept referring to times in the plural. He's one of the few people to do that. And the business of the primordial is not to be obtained, as it were, through myth or by, I mean, people who have myth don't speak of myth in the general. But he is sensitive to those parts of experience that move more slowly than the more ephemeral parts of how to move back and forth between the particular and the more general conditions. In general, architecture is not a sort of concept that sits in front of us, but is part of those deeper conditions. It's not something to be made the object of a zeitgeist. It can be seen that way, so on and so forth. But I think he was moving constantly back and forth between motifs which are much more primordial and motifs which are much more ephemeral. He could constantly turn his opinions upside down on any particular aspect of that as he was working through that.
Stan, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, the issue of avant-garde, I have already had a brief conversation with Hilda. I find that, I'm repeating literally what I just in the break discussed with her, I find somehow Poggioli's 4 categories, as they were so wonderfully described by Hilda an hour ago, more helpful than Peter Bürger's basic hypothesis that there is that the avant-garde, the essence of the avant-garde is the annihilation of the concept of art, because most of the phenomena that he describes that would have to be subsumed in this category, starting of course with Duchamp's fountain, are of course an attack on the system of art, but at the same time are only to be experienced and do only exist as gestures within the system of art. So I can't see. As a matter of fact, paradoxically, I think that Peter Bürger's idea of there having to be a complete break between the concept of avant-garde and the institutions of art is now being enacted in our universalized consumer society, where the borderline, in fact, does not exist anymore. But in the so-called, as I continue to say, avant-garde culture of the 19-teens and 20s, there was an enormous amount of playfulness about this these attacks at the institution of art, and certainly on the side of people like Duchamp. But if you accept Peter Bürger's radical definition of avant-garde art, then clearly you cannot accept Le Corbusier among the avant-gardists. But if you start from the, I think, more descriptive, empirical definitions offered by Poggioli, then I would find appropriate what Hilda has said, that he is in certain ways very avant-gardist, and in certain ways a traditional avant-gardist. I would absolutely agree with that concept that he is among the avant-garde culture of the 19-teens and 20s, the traditionalist. I mean, Esprit Nouveau, also given its explicit political affiliations and its explicit political, if there is such a thing as political, explicit political undertones, it is absolutely impossible to consider it politically as avant-garde. It is politically conservative and culturally avant-garde according to the standards given by Poggioli. I don't know whether this is an answer to...
Yeah, can I just get Hilda? Just 1 second, and then Charles.
Yeah. I just want to clarify that the notion of Bürger is not so much about the annihilation of art. I think that's a misunderstanding, because well, it's about the abolishment of art as an institution, which does not mean the annihilation of art, but rather means the merging of art into life, that there would be a kind of new social organization based on the principle of art rather than based on principles of rationality. That's of course a very utopian notion, but that's so. It's not about the abolishment of art as such, but of the institution. And that's why it's of interest to me, because I'm very much interested in those moments in the 20th century where also the kind of boundaries, the limits which are traditionally drawn between architecture and building, where these boundaries become destabilized. That's where I'm particularly interested in, and that's why I find the concept of Bürger rather productive, to use it as a kind of tool to interpret these conditions. And these conditions I do recognize in some of the work which was carried out in Das Neue Frankfurt, for example, and in some writers like, for example, Sybil Moholy-Nagy or Catherine Bauer, but I do not recognize them in Le Corbusier. So that's why, that's the background of my paper.
Thank you. Charles?
Well, like Stan, I also had a chat with Hilda between these talks, and with a different point over the avant-garde. I pointed out that, you know, at the end of his life, he visited Pessac, and he made those cryptic, incriminating remarks when he saw how the inhabitants had changed it through life. He said, life is right, the architect is wrong. Life is right, the architect is wrong, you know, which is like the Cretan liar's paradox, isn't it? Because if he's right, he's wrong. If he's wrong, he's right. So we don't know whether that comment was made to show that, like Oldenburg, he wanted to operate in the gap between life and art. And this brings up the sublation, as Peter Bürger and you were saying, of life, of art into life. And your position, as I understand it, Hilda, is more on the social sublation of art into life, whereas Oldenburg and the avant-garde is often on the artistic sublation of art, if I may say. You know, I mean, Oldenburg is not trying to change society. In any case, for me, I want to give yet another definition of the avant-garde and be pedantic about it, because the avant-garde actually was, used. If you look in the OED up until about 10 years ago, the Oxford English Dictionary used to, up until 10 years ago, define avant-garde. I think its last usage was 1560, you know, the advanced troupe. And it didn't include all the interesting definitions that interest us. But Saint-Simon and others around, and Auguste Comte, had a definition of it as the new priesthood. And it's important to remember this because it's in this spiritual, prophetic, artistic avant-gardism that I think you get a new Christianity. In fact, that's what it was called, the new Christianity. So we could call it a kind of post-Christianity with Saint-Simon. So this avant-garde were to be the leaders. They weren't to be the followers. They were to be like the new priests. I mean, this is clear. This is not just a metaphor. This is a program for the artists to be priests. And the rhetoric, because of the collapse of religion, before Nietzsche, before God was dead, and this was completely understood, is of course understood even at that time through Hegelianism, through the French Revolution. So the avant-garde has this role, and it's interesting that in Le Corbusier's hometown of La Chaux-de-Fonds, Bakunin came, the anarchist, and established a magazine called Avant-Garde. Now, I don't know that Le Corbusier read it, and I don't know if there was trickle-down anarchism through Bakunin into his father and into himself. He certainly read Rousseau, and he was interested in that sort of formation of the social and the artistic. But I think what is clear is that Le Corbusier saw himself as a prophet, as a religious teacher without a religion. And in a sense, I think that was always his problem. The city, in bringing harmony to an industrial civilization, became his mission in a way. And yet, the more you look at that, the more crazy it becomes. So he had a religion which was misplaced. It was the wrong theory of urbanism. But that was, and then it became a cosmic thing. Now, that's why I think this notion maybe that he was a conservative avant-garde, because he sublated life into the cosmos or into nature, instead of dealing with the real people of Pessac and the real working class or the real technical problems. He idealized it, and then he transcended it, and then he turned it into an art. But I do think he was in this Saint-Simonian sense, I think he was an avant-gardist. He really wanted to change society. At least he thought he really wanted to, and he talked himself into that view, and then that's why he ended his life, the last 10 years, being very disturbed and very, comparing himself to Don Quixote, and a complete failure. And that's why he's in tears half the time, even with all those great successes. So, because that didn't work. Just one little comment then on what Stan said about the painting thing. I think it's clear that he wanted to be a painter, and that La Platinier said, you're never going to make it as a painter, right? And it's clear all his life he really suffered under the rejection as a painter, and he really wished he were Picasso, and I think he tracked Picasso. And he said in 1920, I want to be a businessman, and he started those 4 companies, all of which went bankrupt, by the way. He said, I want to be a businessman so I can be really rich like the Rockefellers in order to go home and paint. That's how he saw himself. So, on a certain level, I think at least that starts very early. He is a Ruskinian painter, and he remained a crypto one.
Can I just get Tim to comment on this question, especially in relation to the suburbs and the kind of agrarian, the progressive and the kind of agrarian at the same time, maybe. And you should have this mic.
Okay. Well, I was going to say something slightly different, actually. I was going to try to continue the argument, because I think it's an interesting one. That I can't see that any way of talking about Le Corbusier and a notion of avant-garde of one kind or another that will make any sense unless it takes into account the fact that for him art and life were in conflict. Charlie's right to say that he says life is right, the architect is wrong. In his practice, life steps down to give way for art, again and again in the detail of the project. He rejects the human solution for the architecturally effective one. And in a sense, he's constructing, always in his work, he's constructing the next volume of the Œuvre Complète. It's at that level of scale that he is progressive. He knows he can't put two things in the same, the Œuvre Complète. So it's at that level he's driven by a very strong sense. And the other conflict, which is throughout his work, is between progress and permanence. The comparison, I think it was Hilda showed it, the Paestum, Parthenon, and the two cars. Parthenon has reached a point of no return, of permanent and immanent value, for which there can be no improvement for Le Corbusier. This is a semi-mystical belief. He agrees with René, the Prière de l'Acropole. I got the name wrong. Which you know. Right. Bon, d'accord. We all know. Renan. That's right. Renan. La Prière de l'Acropole, which is
sur l'Acropole.
Sur l'Acropole. Thank you. It's good to have a footnote here.
Thank you.
Which celebrates the Parthenon as a building, which is virtually religious building. At the same time, he's driven by a sense of progress, and I think you find this. It's like, Russian dolls. Inside his general worldview, inside the scale of the Œuvre Complète, inside the scale of what he's going to do today, inside the scale of the decision what to do on the drawing board of how the project should work, he's pulled in these different directions. On the one hand, he tries to drive a project forward. On the other hand, he tries to find the right solution. The right solution is one that has immanent value for him. So I think these contradictions are built. It's not a question of him changing from one moment to the rest of his life. I think they're there throughout his work, and you keep finding them at every level at which you work and studying him, and at every level at which he expresses himself.
Could I then ask for any comments or questions? Eric, so I'll give you this voice.
This may sound rather trivial, but I've been dying to say it all day. For my generation of architects, Corb was God. There is no good putting it any other way. There were some lesser gods, but he was God. Today, I've learned all about the different persona he put forward, reinventing himself. I'm not sure how aware that all the young architects were of this at the time, or whether this is something that's developed since then. Could somebody help to clarify that for me?
It seems to me that people shouldn't have been aware of this. Should not have, because I think it's the very nature of architecture to be consistent. And I think the whole question of the notion of continuous revolution and reinvention seems to me to be at odds with the nature of what an architect would want to communicate to his clients. You need to be consistent and persistent, because you're going to build a building that's going to last longer than you are. What happens if you change your mind tomorrow? So I think one question that comes to mind is how to remain credible and convincing when one so often alters one's perspective.
Are we talking about the influence?
I think that's right. I think that's right.
But
I think that for many architects like myself, other even generation older than me, I think that particularly the change that happened after the war, with the unité, with the particularly using of the concrete in a different way, I think there's no question it was a shock. And the response, for example, of Sterling is the one good example for this. But I think that what he come after this, what he come or with this group, was so stunning that it was looked as if it's a continuation of the invention, but from the point of view of the basic of architecture, it was a shock for people who tried to follow. So I think it was a revolution, a shock on one hand, but the continuation in the creativity, and that's what it looked like, is as if it's continuation totally. But it's definitely a huge break. And now we sense it even more and more.
David, can you have any thoughts on this? Can you take the mic?
Well, there is one reflection that's occurred to me in some connection, I think, with the comment or the question that you just made. And that's that I think even as the post-war generation, after the void of the war, Corbusier was still prime architectural influence, probably, to students at the A in the 50s. To me, one of the greatest revelations, actually, was that from being a generation who had received Corb through the Complet as a sort of fait accompli, a collection of perfect works, as it were, within his own terms at least. One of the great revelations for me, and one which has been added to today, have been Tim's revelations about the struggle through a series of really crude steps. It was one of the most reassuring books I've seen from that point of view, to realise that one's God had feet of clay, and that although the achievements that one has had oneself as an architect may not have reached the perfections of the earth complet, at least the part that's been most recognisable has been the struggle. And looking at the evolution of the weekend house, simply added one more to this chapter of struggles, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I've enjoyed the rest of the day too, but that was perhaps one of the most revelatory.
I'd like to ask the panel about the issue of professionality for Corbusier. I read an interview yesterday with my friend, the artist Dan Graham, and he said, I can't think of anything more obnoxious than the idea of professional artist, or the idea of connecting professionality with an artist. Now, one profound difference between the practice of art and architecture in the 20th century, despite any common notion of the avant-garde between the two practices, is that architects have remained a profession. They have professional organizations, they live up to academic standards and production standards, industrial standards, all kinds of things like that. And in terms of the way that artists practice their career also, they are not expected necessarily to work with clients. The whole point about a modern artist is that they have no system of patronage, that the alienation of the modern artist is instituted in the fact that they do their work independently and put it on free sale. The notion of the client and the patron has almost disappeared from modern art. It has not disappeared from architecture. And the whole business of practicing architecture is instituted through a system of clientage and professionalism. And this cannot sit very easily with avant-gardism of any kind, whether it's Berger's model or Poggioli's model or the elusive pattern of Corbusier's career.
Can I answer a little bit of that?
If you could be brief, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think, just to bring up the brand, Moisten's favorite subject, the brand gives the architect a kind of universal freedom that the artist has of no client, because if you're branded strongly enough, then the brand overcomes all resistance. In other words, when Le Corbusier becomes a product, then the client has to take it like a man. Whatever he's been given, whatever castor oil he's been given, pointed out by a lot of art critics, that architecture is sold on that level, and therefore the atelier of patient research becomes a place where Gary cooks his brand as freely as the artist cooks his brand, and they both swim in a sea of marketing.
Since Charles has mentioned this brand thing a few times, I should maybe say a couple of words about that. I'm not really into brands, but I think what I am interested in, including Charles's own work, are the situations and conditions that give rise to branding, as opposed to being necessarily interested in the project of instigating brands. I think that's a slightly different thing. So I might in fact be interested in your own work, Charles, because of your capacity to be able to construct certain brands rather than something where I'm necessarily trying to promote the brand. But so that's the end of that conversation. But anyway, okay.
I just want to thank the panel very much for making such a fresh set of readings for the benefit of everyone. It was probably in all senses of that word as well. And I wanted to refer to a couple of specific examples. That in Professor von Moos's presentation, we had a reading of Corb's reading of Manhattan, almost seen in respect, or literally seen in respect of Delirious New York, and that retrospective reading. And in Peter Carl's presentation, this look at the salon cuisine of the Villa Savoy was an extremely provocative juxtaposition, almost like the sort of radical brief slips that our students are engaging in, or where automobiles crash through galleries. Where automobiles crash through galleries, one is thinking of your shelf, from the salon to the cuisine. To what extent, I would like the panel to consider, are we engaging in a kind of historical revisionism to meet our needs at the moment? And I suppose that's what I want to raise, is the danger of revisionism, but also to say how exciting the set of discussions was. But I think there is a danger of revisionism in respect of core. Maybe it's a sort of creative revisionism, a sport revisionism.
Danger. Freshness brings revisionism.
It's only a very brief remark on this issue of life and art and avant-garde. Is what thinking on that's perhaps that, if not the division, but at least the tension between art and life is part of the avant-garde experience in a way. And I could refer only to Hannes Mayer's experience in Mexico, for instance, to show to what extent this that's supposed to be that wing of the avant-garde more connected with life can have big conflicts with life. So that's it.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, in a way,
that might be too
I was thinking in what Peter Carl said for a while about bringing Earth and bringing the horizon inside the drawing, and also this idea of Hilde and the discussion afterwards about Corbusier being a conservative. I'm not sure if the word conservative is able to express the kind of problem which is underlying this relationship between avant-garde and tradition. And I prefer the word tradition in a way, both tradition of the new and the new tradition, to express this kind of tension, because it's quite obvious that Corbusier was interested in classical art, quite obvious that he was interested in Middle Ages, that it's quite clear that he was attacking the academy for recovering something from the past. All of this has been discussed. I think Reinhard Banham has been quite celebrated for making this kind of connection to Beaux-Arts tradition and whatever. And I think I was remembering an avant-garde definition of classic is that of Ezra Pound. This classic is something that remained fresh for a long time, which I found incredibly related with the same definition that Plutarchus made on the Parthenon. And I think that Corbusier was interested on that kind of freshness of the past that remains. And he was interested in tradition, in a new side of tradition, to make this same tradition bright again, something like that.
2 seconds. One of the reasons I think he thought of a synthèse des arts is because so much of cultural meaning had been absorbed into whatever art was. And both revolutionary and pietistic, you could go from one to the other in 10 minutes, and you could really since Romanticism. And the effort to even think the problem in terms of art and life as a kind of halfway world between the previous institutions that had deemed to be dead in the absence of any new institutions. I mean, for example, when he looks at technology, he does it like Leonardo. He's not interested in the calculations. He has no idea. I'm sure he doesn't have any idea how those engines work. I mean, he's trying to find them as stories. If anything, his interest in engines has more to do with the grotesque than it has to do with technology. And I think I think it's, if we get lost in genius, we get lost in the avant-garde and the story of the artist making choices, we, in a kind of cultural museum, we really do go to branding very quickly. Basically what branding is a clickable myth. It's as much identity, as little identity as you need to be able to do something with it. And you just miss the depth of the problem.
I wanted to bring up an issue which worries me in my relation to Le Corbusier, and that is has to do with the thing that Charles just said, quoting Le Platinier, you will never make it. I mean, Le Platinier, who tells repeatedly his student genre, you will never make it as a painter, you are just not gifted to be a painter. Dessine, ça suffit, make your drawings, you will be an excellent architect. The question, which has not been answered nor by me nor by anybody else today, perhaps by implication by Daniel Nagele, was Le Platinier right or wrong? I don't want to give an answer to that question, but I would like to suggest, does anybody have a plausible explanation? I think it has a lot to do with this question of identity. Why all the known French art critics, for instance, people have written, like Servos, of course, one of the arbiters of taste in French painting in the 1920s and 30s, Frank Elgar, to mention another one, have been absolutely negative as far as Le Corbusier's quality as a painter is concerned. I mean, I don't need to refer. I mean, Christopher Green in the catalogue of the London exhibition has given an incredible collage of quotes which clearly document that the official art criticism in France in the period between the two wars, and this has continued into the 50s and the 60s with very few exceptions. I think among the French art critics and museum people, there are basically two, Jean Cassou and Georges Salle, who have been favorable, who have been interested. And then we see the letters that Le Corbusier wrote to Jean Cassou, because I was so disappointed. I read first in the Fondation a letter by Le Corbusier to Jean Cassou. What a bonheur you have created in your inclusion of my name into the history of modern painting and so on. And I thought, okay, probably Jean Cassou has really devoted a major chapter to Le Corbusier in the history of modern painting. I looked up the book. It was about half a page in a book of about 400 pages on the history of modern art. So Le Corbusier was happy that at least one critic would admit him into the universe of contemporary art. I, as a Swiss, would like also to say that I find the fact that the only layout that he had, no, that's not the right term, the only market that he had as a painter was in Switzerland. This is a very bad sign, because Switzerland has never been known for being the place where great art is born or branded, for that matter. So I think there is something alarming about this lack of success as Le Corbusier the painter, and I think no recent show, including the London show, well, we have had a short argument because then Nagele apparently was very impressed by the Aalborg show. I continue to have this problem that I fail to be able to place. I am always embarrassed in museums when I see a painting by Le Corbusier next to a painting by Léger, which occasionally happens. I'm always embarrassed, but I hope I'm the only one in this room who feels that way, but like to be informed by people who don't feel that way. Yes.
Beg
your pardon?
Was it Leger who said, my friend
I didn't understand him this way. I don't remember this particular passage. I remember that Le Corbusier sent him a catalogue of his painting, and Léger sent him a postcard back. Thank you very much for your catalogue. Don't forget architecture.
Paradoxically, of course, when the young Corbusier came to Paris, Perret liked him because of his nice watercolors.
Yeah.
He's the young man who made the beautiful watercolors.
Yeah, the watercolors are wonderful. The watercolors are wonderful.
Yeah, that's right. I get to, well, just two things. One is, of course, he suffered just as much from criticism about his architecture. I mean, in 1938, when he was suffering from the hammering he'd had in Zurich with his art exhibition there, he was also deeply hurt that Haute Coeur, you know, the bastion of Beaux-Arts type architectural historians, had also dismissed Le Corbusier. Why on earth should Le Corbusier, in 1938, with his career already made, be upset at you know, the director of the Louvre, or whatever Haute Coeur was then? You know, I mean, an official person who obviously rejected Le Corbusier's architecture. So I think these things are very strange. I mean, he was very, very sensitive about the response that he had, and his success was built.
But he had no work then, and
despite
I mean,
criticism.
He had no work in Paris then. That's why he was upset. So
And
if a major friend,
he
he's bankrupt.
as well.
So that would explain that, though.
No, but it was all. I mean, actually, you could put together very harsh criticisms from all the key critics on architecture throughout the 20s and 30s. There was no time when Le Corbusier had a strong press in France, in Paris. Really?
Paris, yeah.
In Paris.
So.
Well, anyway, the other thing is just responding to that point, which I think deserves an answer. All visions are revisions. Okay. Point one. Secondly, I mean, the reason that Le Corbusier is a great architect is because the greatest minds have studied him. Okay. I mean, it's just a question, you know, just, yeah, I can assure you it's not me, but it's because all the creative architects who've been practicing since Le Corbusier made his name have reworked Le Corbusier. That is why Le Corbusier is an inescapable obstacle who has to be considered. And the reason that we're interested in him is because he is very nourishing. There is a terrific depth in his written work and all the various different levels of creativity that Charlie pointed out in the first day. You know, it's those levels which provide the information for criticism and for reuse and for precisely revision, which is why he's still there now, as opposed to Mary Stevens perhaps,
Or Mies.
Or what? Or what?
Or Mies.
No.
James Dunning. I think there's a case for saying perhaps that Corbusier should have been neither an architect nor a painter, but a sculptor, because the figures that he puts into his drawings have such an intense sculptural presence. And for example, the drawing of the seated figure that he envisaged as being the monumental figure in front of the Ministry of Education in Rio is, I think, one of the great unrealized works of sculpture of the 20th century. I don't think that any of the sculptors, well, I haven't seen this exhibition on in Leeds at the moment, of sculptures taken from his paintings by Savina qualify, because those aren't sculptural works. But another, I think, astoundingly sculptural work of Corbusier's is the portrait of his mother, the drawing that is, it's as though she's hewn out of rock. To me, that seems the great. No, he was a great architect and a great painter, in my opinion, but I wish he'd had time to be a great sculptor as well.
Probably following on from the question about whether he's a great sculptor, one of okay, there have been many copies of, or very close copies of his buildings, and they often fail because of the lack of site specificity. And one of the things that one might identify in his work is his accuracy in actually understanding the place. His favourite place to go to was Montségur, which is an Albigensian fortress. And he used to go there to regenerate his, this is what I'm told, his soul. And that is somewhere which gives you an extraordinary sense of place. And you know, I think that is certainly the case in something like Villa Savoye, where the shelf, which was mentioned by Peter, which I also was interested in the shelf, I think is a device to control one's relationship with the horizon, which sadly now is obscured by the school that's been built around the building. But that particular relationship, which you're held in relation to the long window that goes around, is actually then reinforced in terms of the south elevation to the longer horizon. So at that point you understand relativity, which is another issue which I think he picks up particularly strongly in that building. In the Villa Savoye you've got two modes of going vertically. One which is quick and actually is service there, the other which is slow and is the ramp. And you know, I think that perhaps there are other issues which are possibly avant-garde, which are understood more in the section than maybe in the chosen photographs or the paintings. Could I just say, I've really enjoyed today as well, so it's
Maybe I'd just like to put a different spin on the question of was he a good painter, was the judgment of his teacher correct? And I think it also follows on from a point that was just made, that the reason Corbusier is interesting is that we can still have a conversation over an entire day about him and still generate new knowledge. I'm not so much interested in Corb as a biographical sort of project, as a biography. It's more of the retrospective construction and continual reconstruction of this persona that allows us to still formulate new ideas. And in that regard, I would just like to maybe suggest, and this is completely off the top of my head, not totally, but that one of the interesting things about his use of media is that it's ultimately undecidable whether he was a good painter or even a good architect. That in fact, he might have been quite bad at all of them if viewed from a disciplinary perspective, right? This is painting, this is sculpture, this is architecture, and they have enclosed interiorities that define qualities of judgment within those disciplines. That in fact, he might have been quite, it's possible, I'm not saying it's true, that one of the interesting things about him is that his work suspends those categories of judgment and disciplinarity. And today, when obviously the discipline of architecture itself is undergoing a new mutation, we could call it. The disciplinarity of what constitutes the architect's practice, we could call it professionalism, whatever, is being transformed. This is why, in a sense, he's quite interesting.
I really want to try and, there's somebody who's been there before you. Can you give it, John? And I really want to try and come to a close, if I may. Sorry. Just speak to each other. Yeah. Just speak. Don't worry, it's on. Just hold it.
On.
Yes, it is. Yeah. John, just hold the microphone to your mouth and speak. Don't worry about anything.
all these modern devices. Yes. All I wanted to say was, John Bancroft, all I was wanting to say was a follow-on from James Dunnett to ask whether architecture is not a sculptural art. And it seems to me that Corb was an architectural sculptor or a sculptural architect. It may not be fashionable at the moment, and in fact when I look around at much that is produced, it has no real sculptural qualities at all. But if we go back and we look at Michelangelo and architects of that sort of caliber, it was essentially a sculptural art.
Thank you. Just maybe, since I have the mic, just a couple of a couple of sentences, and then I really want to thank everyone here. I think it's important, in a way, to not forget about certain conditions of discipline. because in a way the whole, what I think Stan was touching on in terms of the quality of the painting, or the way that the work of architecture is also a mechanism or a certain device for particular kinds of investigations, should be remembered, because I appreciate the fact that there is a moment of suspense in terms of certain disciplinary boundaries, but at the same time, the very discoveries that are made through specific projects and what they do, I think should also be recognized, in the sense that the incompletion or the problematics that they raise are still very much part of the research that they do. So I think that, ironically, it demands of us to expect more precision, more specificity, more kind of articulation of the discipline, and it is through that then the material of architecture itself becomes productive, rather than seeing it in terms of something that is in a moment of suspense, because then it could also, in terms of the argument, it could lead to anything would go in one sense. I know that's not what you mean, but I think what I have certainly got from the discussion today is precisely this attention to the detail and the many new chords, the new moments, new possibilities of reinvention that are going to be there for us to think in terms of the production of work, but in terms of the writing. I want to take this opportunity then to thank all of you for spending the whole day here and participating in the conference. And I'd like to thank Tim, Fernando, Hilda, Charles, Peter, Daniel, and Stan for their presentations. And last but not least, I want to thank Joel Newman and Mickey Hawkes, without whom definitely this conference would not be possible. Thank you very much. Thank you.